From LPM,
Louisville Public Media.
Support for LPM podcasts comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.
Hey Charlene, 好久没见了，你怎么样？
Mabuti, kamusta ka?
एक minute, मला नहीं समझता.
Wait, okay, y'all want to try this in English?
Yes. Good. Yeah, that would be great.
You're listening to Where Y'all Really From. I'm your host for this episode, Dan Wu, food guy, rabble-rouser, and 1.5 generation Chinese American.
And I'm Charlene Buckles, a proud Filipina Kentuckian.
I'm Nima Kulkarni, a proud Desi.
And today we're talking about, in case you couldn't tell, we're talking about language. First off, we all come to this table with a bunch of different languages other than English. And I think it's safe to say we all have very different, somewhat different relationships to our languages. Nima, what languages besides English do you speak, and did you grow up learning them? What's your relationship with those languages?
Yeah, I think it's super important, my relationship with language. So I speak Marathi. I'm Maharashtrian. Maharashtra is the state where Mumbai is and Goa is. And so I, would not be able to speak Marathi. I also understand Hindi. I don't necessarily speak it so well. And I'm functionally illiterate in both languages, but I'm able to carry on a conversation in Marathi. To this day, because when I was growing up, so we moved to Louisville when I was 6, and my parents made sure at that time, just growing up, that we'd have, regular phone calls with my grandparents in India. My grandmother did not speak any English, so it had to be in Marathi. And so, and it was expensive back then, like long distance calls, international calls. Like there weren't like all these plans that we have now. There was no WhatsApp, there was no Vonage. And so, but it was so important to them that they made sure that we talked to them. And my brother even still understands. He doesn't speak it so well, but he still understands Marathi as well. And I don't know, honestly, that I would feel as Indian as I do if I wasn't able to speak the language as clearly and as sort of easily as I do, even with Indians in India. I'm sure they, sort of clock me for an outsider as soon as 5 minutes in, but, we can carry on this conversation and communicate. But yeah, I think I'm so grateful to my parents for making sure that happened, because without that, I think it would really have affected, my own identity as an Indian American.
Yeah, and for me, I came, we moved to Southern California when I was almost 5 years old, but my mom, even in the Philippines, wanted me to respond in English even though we were in the Philippines, and actually the language of the Philippines, or the main language, is Tagalog, and there's lots of different dialects of that. So I was immersed in that. I could completely understand it all. We watched movies growing up. We talked to my cousins, and it was all around me growing up, and so I could fully understand it. But that. The parts of my brain to be able to speak it, which is a very different part of your brain, and what I've always taught when I was teaching early education, it was never formed. So I could receive language and understand it fully, but then to create it, I was never given, I never really had that. And so I still, it is a huge gap that I have. I had to really think about, how to translate it actively, which is very similar to when I was learning Spanish as a high schooler. It was just very disconnected to me, which is ironic because I could fully understand it. And so I think that's really interesting. I think, of course, that was something that my mom and my grandfather, who fought in World War II, really wanted for his grandchildren, to be able to articulate English very well. Even when I was growing up, my grandfather would have me read out loud newspaper, articles, which of course did not end very well because I cannot. I mumble all the time. But I think in terms of my language and Tagalog, it's even when I was an adult, it was really disheartening because, like what Nima was saying, she really identifies so strongly because so strongly Indian because of how she could speak that native tongue so well and go back and forth. Whereas for me, it's such a disconnect, and that's actually very common for Filipinos in my generation. And so it's called, and I think actually one of our guests last season said it's called backwards tongue. And I can't even now, like, I can't even, like, articulate that in Tagalog. I would have to Google it, which is awful.
My experience growing up was, I think, pretty similar to Nima's. I came here as a kid at 8 years old, and I also lived with my grandmother for a number of years, and she only spoke Mandarin Chinese. So I came here as a very precocious, well-read third grader, and my language has deteriorated slowly and gradually over the last 40 years to where now I am told by Chinese aunties that I meet that I still have really precise, like Beijing standard 普通话, Beijing Mandarin, but my vocabulary is that of a third grader with a concussion. Like it's not even third grade level. And so anytime I need to talk about anything complicated, like, medical stuff or political stuff, I have to very often, as you said, Google Translate it. When I was trying to tell my mom that I was running for city council, I realized I didn't have any of that vocabulary to talk about it. Like I didn't know how to talk about ballot or fundraising. So I typed it all out in English, ran it through Google Translate, translated it into Chinese, and then copy and pasted that into an email to her so that she could understand it. And I'm betting that that's a very common experience for a lot of us sort of second or even third generation folks. The disconnect or the connection to our language, I think, is so vital to our sense of identity and, as Nima said, how Indian she feels, right, relative to what her language skill is. Another thing, I think, for those of us who came here really young, I would love to hear your experiences of how much did you all have to translate for your parents?
So I really didn't have to because everybody in India is taught English. As a former British colony, that is, an official language. And then you have your various regional languages. So there's hundreds of languages spoken in India, but everybody is taught English. And it's interesting, I mentioned, so in South India, you have a very strong cultural identity, and they, may or may not choose to speak English, but they all know it. So everyone is, educated in English. So the short answer is I didn't have to translate for my parents at all, but they do have accents. So the most I would do is just maybe, clarify in my American accent what they were trying to say. But that was few and far between the instances of that because they speak perfect English.
Yeah, kind of the same with my mom. I mean, she was also very similar in the Philippines is that there's many dialects and languages, but Tagalog is the main one that's like the national language, but then also everyone is taught English at school informally. And then I think because my grandfather and his experience in World War II really wanted, to be quote unquote Americanized and to be able to be versed in English and all of his grandchildren to be versed in English, that it came very natural for my mom to come into the States and then be able to articulate things. There are various nuances that I had to kind of translate. And even now, like, I love you, Mom, but we definitely have like different communication styles and like a depth of understanding that that you would only have like growing up here. But it is a very, her understanding of the mechanical English and how to put words together and how to put sentences together and even the different accents, like she could do very well, I think, because of what she had growing up with my grandfather. My dad, on the other hand, did not have as much, but he never really articulated that he didn't understand. He just kind of like brushed it off, and he had more of an accent than my mom, and so he was always really self-conscious about that. But in terms of translation, I never really had to do too much of that. Dan, did you?
I did. For my parents, my dad had a better grasp of English because he was in an academic setting, so he had kind of needed it day to day, whereas my mom did not. But also, it was not just language, but just kind of navigating bureaucracies, navigating utility bills, navigating random person coming to the door and my mom not knowing what the heck they were selling or trying to do, and having to kind of push me forward as an 8, 9, 10-year-old to engage with this other adult about figuring out what this thing is. And I don't remember like as a kid ever being resentful or anything. It was just like, it was honestly just part of my job. Like I knew walking up to a counter that I would probably be the one to speak. And as I became a tween and a teen, I got more frustrated and annoyed because I'm just like, oh, why do I have to do this? And I don't even know what you want. And what am I trying to tell them? And just, being a typical teenager stuff. But it's an interesting sort of duty that a lot of us had to take on from a very young age.
We're headed into a break, but we'll be right back with more conversation about our relationships with language. And later on, we'll hear from you. This is Where Y'all Really From?
Support for this podcast comes from Vision Zero. On foot or behind the wheel, safety is a shared responsibility. And Vision Zero Louisville believes 0 roadway fatalities is the only acceptable amount. Their mission is to foster a community where everyone can safely reach their destination, no matter how they get there. More at visionzerolouisville.org.
Your mornings are busy, and finding the time to stay up to date on what's happening in Louisville and southern Indiana isn't easy. I'm Bill Burton. Join me to stay informed on your terms each weekday with the LPM Daily News Briefing, the news you need to start your day, from Louisville Public Media. See you in the morning.
Welcome back to Where Y'all Really From? I'm Charlene Buckles. Today, we're talking about languages and how they shape our identity.
You talked about accents a little bit. This is an experience I think pretty much all Asian Americans, no matter when you were born, how long you've been in the States, how many generations you've been in the States, we have all at some point been complimented on how good our English is. I think
that's so true.
And people have also noted probably that we don't have accents. When you all hear these things, these essentially they're compliments, right? But they're compliments in this big, encased in, racial prejudice. How do you all react to them, these encounters?
Honestly, with those encounters, I get really offended because I don't have an accent. I have an American accent, I should say. See, even that. Mm-hmm. I don't have any kind of accent other than an American accent when I speak. And so for somebody to say something like, you speak English really well, or, oh, you don't have an accent. So the you don't have an accent part, I think I can handle more than, oh, you speak English really well. It's like, I sound just like you. What else is it about me that would make you think I wouldn't know English at all? Mm-hmm. And that is a whole thought process that people don't even realize, but that's the only place it can come from. You're looking at me, you're hearing me, and on the phone you would have no idea. Mm-hmm. But looking at me, there's something else about me that makes you think I shouldn't speak English this well. So I find it very offensive. I find it more offensive than when people ask where I'm really from or, any of these other discussions we've had, because that process does, to me, come from a place of very Eurocentric racism.
Mm-hmm.
I think when I get those comments, it is so hard to process it because it used to come more often, growing up when I was in my teens or in my 20s. Now as an adult, it doesn't happen very often. And so when it does happen, I'm so taken aback. The where y'all really from and where you from is definitely more common. But like Nima said, when someone says wow, you speak really well, or you don't have an accent, is just, it does almost come from a very negative othering place, more so than the question, where y'all really from? And especially since like my mom, who got that more often because she was a first generation, like she came here as an adult, and like people were surprised she didn't have was very surprised that she didn't have an accent. Like it was like something about that made her really proud, almost like, oh wow, like that's, you know, like I can assimilate, I could be a part of, you would never know that, you know, like because I think my grandfather really instilled like wanting to learn English in his children, and so that was like a big accomplishment for her. Whereas for me, it's like you don't know anything about me and you're assuming all of these, you know, weird racist things because you just look at me and think that I'm completely different and I'm not from here. So I think that is actually a really interesting sentiment, you know, that I've never really processed, and I'm like currently at this very moment I'm processing. But it's, you know.
Hey, I'm glad we can help. This podcast is cheaper than therapy for a lot of us. I mean, you talk about your parents and your mom sort of taking pride in their English proficiency and taking pride in losing the accent. I mean, if you think about it, that idea is a zero-sum game, right? Like you can't be more American without being less Filipino in that sense, in terms of language. And to be proud of one over the other, you can't, it's hard not to shed the idea of like being Filipino is bad and being American is good. And therefore I'm proud of being more American, sounding more American, shedding that sort of accent. And I know people don't think of things in those conscious kind of ways, but it's definitely there. And I find that really fascinating.
I do think, though, which I like as I think about my mom and as I'm like actually processing some of this in therapy on my own, it is really interesting because it's almost like a really, again, like thinking about like when she first came here and like the culture that was like the 80s and 90s in America, and then particularly in Kentucky. It is a really it's a way in which she survived, and that was a really, and how she like shielded herself and how she's carrying. It's the way also how we talk about multitudes, right? It's almost like a black belt in code switching. Like you're like able to, you don't to survive in this particular space. And to protect my peace, I am going to talk like you and walk like you, and that does not negate who I really am. And especially when I'm in this other space, and I grew up with a lot of, you know, Filipino, she had a lot of Filipino friends who also moved from California to Kentucky through her job. And she was like, I'm not either or. Like, I could be in this space and, like, you know, be the boss that I am in accounting or whatever. You know, I don't even know what she did in her everyday job. But, like, do that and then switch to, like, I'm going to sing karaoke until 2 o'clock in the morning and, like, cook Filipino food. And I don't have to be either, like, I don't have to negate each one. It's almost, again, I think it's just like a really cool, I don't know if it's cool. I don't know if that's the word I want to use. But it's a way in which she was able to use code switching to get to where she needed to be and to also, like, keep that peace, which I think is kind of flips it all on its head.
Yeah, I think it's, again, for a lot of us, sort of second, third generation folks, we do exist in a third space. You know, we're third culture kids, and we exist in this sort of nebulous place of whether it's languages or names or our relationships with our parents, our relationships with food. It's this new space, and what's exciting about it is we kind of have the opportunity to carve out what the space looks like, and it doesn't necessarily mean whether or not we have an accent, and it doesn't necessarily mean we speak our quote-unquote native tongues fluently, or we're literate. Nima, I am also a functionally illiterate in Chinese, sadly. I can write my name and like 3 other characters, and that's about it. But it's kind of an exciting space to be in a lot of ways, is that we're not necessarily rejecting the old world and we're not necessarily adopting the new world wholesale, but we are choosing which parts we want to maintain and be able to create this brand new thing out of it. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating today, where demographically Asians are the fastest growing immigrant group in the United States, specifically Indian and Chinese immigrants. And there are large pockets of populations enough to where communities have formed that include first generation, second generation, third generation folks. And so everybody, even within that community. So when we have events, for instance, like Indian events or cultural events, religious events, anything like that, it's fascinating to see, grandparents interacting with kids that were born here, and maybe they don't speak English as well as this, little kid does, but the kid has gone to Hindi school or has learned that language at home. And so it's just fascinating to me how people navigate, even within our own community, the differences in language and accents that didn't really exist. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, there weren't that many Indian families, and everybody was an adult when they came here, so everybody spoke the language, and then you had the kids, and we were all just like trying to figure everything out, but now there's just such a variation of languages spoken. Indian, this is just Indian people. Indian languages spoken. There's a variation in terms of the experience or, level of language, and especially in the ages that are represented in the generations and how and when everybody came here. But everybody recognizes this is their home, and it's just a very fascinating melting pot within, a very specific immigrant group in Kentucky.
Do you all find, too, when you go back, like, I don't know if this has happened to you or you, Dan, because my relationship to language is, like, a little bit different, but I find, like, when I go back to my cousins or when I go with my mom and my aunt and things, and I try to speak in Tagalog, they're like, you, like, sound way too white. You sound a little country. And I'm like, really? And they're just like, that accent's not there. And so even when I was visiting the Philippines when I was in my 20s, I had to even switch the way that I, like, speak English. Like, there's a different tone and a different accent that you have. Like, if I were to speak like this in the Philippines, they would not understand anything I'm saying. But if I spoke in a different cadence, they're like, oh, okay, like I could understand it. So the same way in which you have to switch your accent almost. It would be like if someone who's trying to speak French or Spanish would say like, hola, ¿cómo estás? And it would just be this really like thick, like Southern accent. And so I have to like switch into this like Filipino accent that I don't do consciously at all. Like I just like pick it up, and there's that type of subculture within our cultures that we're still trying to balance. And I don't even know if that's like a fourth space that we're trying to figure out as well. But it's like this way in which we're trying to meld all of these parts of us between being Kentuckian, being Filipino, but then also within the Filipino community as well, and how they either accept or reject us.
So I think that's exactly right. I have this made up accent, to Charlene's point, a completely made up Indian accent. So it's not an Indian accent that you would ever hear from an actual Indian person. I am incapable of not speaking in this accent, even when I'm speaking English, even in the United States, to anybody that's older than me. Like I just switch immediately speaking English into this weird accent. And my parents, they're like, I don't know, you just started doing that one day. We have no idea where it came from or where you got it. It's the most bizarre thing. And I think it's kind of to what Charlene was saying. I mean, it's this weird code switching within your own community, even though they probably think I'm really weird because it's not even like an Indian accent. Like they're like, what is this new thing you're saying?
I've heard that before with you and your dad.
Yeah, I can't help it. I'm telling you, I cannot help it. And it's just fascinating because that's something I'm not even conscious of.
Yeah.
And it just happens because it's some form of respect that I think I'm showing people older than me. And it makes no sense, but that's another way that I try to connect through language or accents, I guess.
Well, this has been a great conversation. Shats Zajela.
Ingat ka.
Purchaverla Pertuya. Where Y'all Really From is created and produced by Dan Wu, Charlene Buckles, May Suramek, and me, Nima Kulkarni. Our executive producer is Laura Ellis. Our associate producer is Alex Biscardi. Kojin Tashiro wrote our theme song, and Leanne Gann created our logo. Where Y'all Really From is part of the Louisville Public Media Podcast Incubator, with support from the Eye Care Institute's Butchertown clinical trials. Our Lexington interviews are recorded at Radio Lex with engineering and assistance by Mark Royce. For more information and to keep in touch, visit whereyallreallyfrom.org.
This week on In Conversation, a discussion of Juneteenth, its history, and upcoming local commemorations. Join us Friday morning at 11 Eastern Time on 89.3 WFPL at lpm.org or wherever you get your podcasts.